Good morning.
Good morning.
Pastor Allison asked me to offer a reflection this morning as part of this year's generosity season. The last few times I've had the opportunity to speak here, I've been asked to talk about a particular passage, and usually from the lectionary. And that's often been something of a challenge. I mean, it's not easy to twist a passage around enough so I can end up talking about what it is that I wanted to talk about in the first place. But today, Pastor Allison gave me no such constrictions. I could pick the Bible texts I want. It will come as very little surprise to anybody who's ever been in a story tent, or ever watched a story tent, or ever been to a youth group meeting, or ever participated on a mission trip, what verses I would pick. A few years back, Nicole Matthias, a multi-story tent alumna, looked at me and said, "I just realized that they're all the same story." A bunch of kids get in a fight about something, then they look at some Bible verses that relate to what the fight was about, before they finally figure out that the most important thing is love. What can I say, Nicole? You found me out. So the same thing happens here. Allison asked me to speak about this text or that text, and before too long, I somehow always end up relating it to love. Loving God and loving your neighbor. Only today promises to be a little different, because today, that's going to be where I start. And the funny thing is, when I actually sat down to go directly at the verses that have guided virtually all my writing at Saugatuck, I came to the realization that all this time that I've been reflecting on these words, I may have been misreading them. If not completely, then at least missing half the point. Isn't that embarrassing? Please pray with me. Holy One, you call us to love you, the divine, and to love our neighbor, and the divine that lies within them. Keep us always mindful of just what love is. Amen. So how many of you here at one time or another have ever had a crush? Come on. I'm not talking about a movie star that you may have had a poster of on your wall. I'm talking about an honest-to-goodness crush where you could have actually known the person. A person with some kind of presence who, for whatever reason, awakened something in you that caught you up in something that just felt overwhelming. My friend David told me the story of when he was in high school. There was this person who caught his eye. Over time, he saw the person here and there, but every time it was the same. It was his crush, and then everybody else. Then, almost naturally, he began to notice there were patterns to when and where he saw the person. Now don't worry, this is not going to turn into a stalking story. But that being said, David soon figured out all the classes his crush was taking. So what he decided to do, his best chance to ever actually get to know his crush, was to just happen to be standing in the hall outside the person's class as it was emptying out. The problem was that his classes were completely on the other side of the building. So what did David do? When his class was over, he would sprint from one end of the building to the other, take up a perch, leaning, oh so casually against the wall, across the hall from his professor's classroom door. And what would he do when the person actually came out? He'd do his best to make eye contact, do a little nod of the head, and then make a subtle half wave of his hand and say, "Hey." That was it. Then he'd sprint back across the building where he'd be late to his next class. Now, I'm having a little fun here with this story, and I admit it's completely at David's expense. That's okay. He lives in Baltimore and will never know. But here's the thing. I know I did similar things or felt similar ways when I was in high school. I saw my kids act in similar ways, and I've heard other people tell enough stories about their growing up that I'm pretty sure this whole crush thing is something most of us go through at one time or another. And the word that David used, the word I used, the words my kids used, and I'm pretty sure the word most of us used when we went through the same thing, of course, is love. I'm so in love. What I'm also pretty sure of, though, is whatever else this kind of crush might actually be, the one thing it has absolutely nothing to do with is love. And that's why I think I've been missing the point all this time about the Bible's great commandment to love. Allison and I were joking a little bit as I was writing this reflection about how pastors and professors are suckers for nounifying verbs and verbifying nouns. You know what I'm talking about? We now friend people. We don't rent a vacation spot, we Airbnb it. And if you're the kind of person who happens to frequent a tavern, it's now enough to say, "Beer me." Strict grammarians may shake their heads, but it was thinking about love, the noun, that made me realize how much I was missing in the Bible's commandment to love when I thought only in terms of love, the verb. Because love, the verb, the love of loving God and loving my neighbor, really feels all about me. The person who's doing the loving, right? If somebody wants to know, does Michael love God or love his neighbor, they're pretty much going to be looking at me. What does Michael feel? How deeply does he feel it? What's he willing to do or not do to give proof of those feelings? Does he think about God and his neighbor all the time? Is he willing to run all the way across a building or across town once a week so he can sit in a pew and lift his hand and say, "Hey, God," on and on like that, but always about Michael. But love, the noun, is something entirely different. Love, the noun, is first and foremost a relationship. It's a relationship that gives life to a crush. Anyone who's ever been blessed to have been in a love relationship knows that if it's not a relationship, it's not love. If anything, the love that's mostly about you is almost the opposite of love. In a way, it's almost opposed to the beloved, set opposite or against the beloved. What is more isolating and lonely than a crush? What makes you feel more like you're not enough, that you fall short, that you're not worthy of the beloved than standing across from a door when your beloved comes out and just keeps walking while you're left standing there with your hand raised in its ineffectual half wave and the sound of the word "hey" still echoing in the air? I'm not suggesting there's something wrong with loving God or loving your neighbor, far from it. What I am suggesting is a change to at least the way I've always thought about how love works in those foundational verses. The challenge for all of us, every person on this planet, is not a feeling challenge, a loving enough challenge, a measuring up challenge, a good enough challenge. The challenge, and I believe it's a far more liberating, empowering, inspirational, and life-giving challenge, is more a relationship challenge. Are we living together in the light of God's love? Are we working together to make straight a way for the Lord in the wildernesses that we share? And since the answer to those questions is almost assuredly, of course not, at least not as much as we could be, then what can we do to bring a little more joy to God today than we brought to God yesterday? What part of our lives can we open to God's love today that we didn't bring yesterday? And then what can we do tomorrow to push that joy even a little further? Because that's what a loving relationship is all about. A walking with no matter what. A constant striving to bring as much joy and peace and hope to the beloved as we are able, and then to accept the joy and peace and hope that we get back. And that's just the loving God part. What would it mean with regard to loving your neighbor? Living in relationship with your neighbor. Living in a love relationship with your neighbor. In a love relationship with our neighbor, we keep the hinges of our heart's doors well oiled, to use Pastor Allison's phrase, so they are always ready to spring open easily to others. We look for ways to bring joy into their lives and accept the joy they bring to ours. In a love relationship with our neighbors, we become the builders God asks us to be. Builders of bridges that span the differences that naturally occur between cultures, nations, faiths, communities, families, sisters, brothers, you and me. Bridges that reach out to the love we trust resides in the core of the other. An aside. There is a glorious freedom when you do one of these things as a layperson. I mean, if Pastor Allison goes back to retranslate a word from an ancient language, she kind of has a responsibility to, be correct. I, on the other hand, feels no such obligations. Take that under advisement when I share with you that the language that Jesus himself spoke was not Hebrew, or Greek, or Latin, or certainly not English. The language he spoke was Aramaic, and in ancient Aramaic, the word for love would be transliterated K-H-U-B-A, Kuba. That I can pretty much stand by, and here's the dicey part. I know in Greek we get to a word, agape, that could roughly be translated as compassion or empathy. What I heard that Kuba was close to was something a little different. It was affection. Crazy, huh? Not just love your neighbor abstractly and from a distance. Maybe we're actually supposed to like our neighbor too. Not adore them from a safe distance across a hallway with a nonchalant wave of the hand. We might be asked to get to know them, to look at the differences between us as potentially complementary. Now, I don't have to be terrified or ashamed of my weak or empty shadow spaces, because your strong points might be able to fill in. And I can also see my gifts, whatever they may be, not as assets to make me special or great, but as tools that can be used to help others fill in their places of challenge. And now we finally get to the part of this reflection that answers the question. Okay, fine, whatever, but what on earth does it have to do with pledging, and why was it scheduled for generosity season? Hey, Art. In a way, it's actually a question I've been asking a lot lately. When you ask people what's the most important thing in life, you may get a variety of answers, but I'll bet you'd be surprised at how little variety you'd find. Because for most people, the answer is going to have something to do with love. The relationships we have that make us better people. The relationships we have that open us and strengthen us and heal us and restore us and engage us. the relationships that we organize our lives around, and on which we base our most significant decisions. But if love is so important to us as individuals, why in our culture does it almost seem invisible? Where do you see it on the front pages or editorial pages of our newspapers? Where do you hear it talked about on television, or really anywhere? Where do our children get to talk about it? In school? One of the best school systems in the country? Seriously? We ask them how they're doing in math and physics and history and English. But love? If love is so important, how could you possibly tell? Where, for that matter, do we get to talk about it? This thing that's supposedly so important. This thing that's really the only thing that God asks us to do. Well, my answer to that question is here. I get to talk about it here. I talk about it with Allison and Dana and Kim as we work together to plan programming. And I am privileged to get to hear our young people talk about it in youth group and on mission trips. And with that, let me share what I found is that young people growing up today are so starved to put love forward and reflect on what it means in their lives that our youth group seems to add new kids every year, not just from this congregation, but from other congregations and other communities and other faiths and no faiths, even if it means they have to go to church to do it. And I talk about it all the time with many of you when I get to hear what it is that you're doing to live out God's love in your lives and why. And in the craziest thing, I get to see it every Sunday in this gloriously out-of-control passing of the peace thing that goes on here every week, almost forever, and even at that has to be stopped before it goes on even longer. So yes, this is in part a promotional piece asking everyone to pledge to this special place where we can talk about love. And do that, please, because this special place needs each and every one of us to do that. And your giving really does help others. It really does. But where it really starts is with loving. The love that lies behind the giving. The love that lies behind the service. The love that lies behind the cooked meal for someone going through a difficult time. The love that lies behind saying hello to somebody you don't know simply because you assume they're worth knowing. Or listening to someone, or praying for them, and accepting when they pray for you. The love that lies in simply trying to keep a smile on your face as your fallback expression. Give out of that. Serve out of that. And remember, when Jesus says it's really all about love, love of God and love of neighbor, he's not just asking you to run over here every Sunday morning to raise your hand and say, hey, because that's not love. You know what love is. I know what love is. The challenge, and sisters and brothers, for all of us is to live into it. Live into it like it was the most important thing in the world. Amen.
Amen.